Zacatecas, like the rest of western Mexico, was deeply affected by the Cristero War. To this day, the war continues to affect the lives of ordinary people and even their relations with church and state. Many people see this as a religious war, and indeed it was a religious war, but it was much more than that.
I believe that in the case of Peru, but everywhere as well, it is very important to know what has happened in the past so that you have a real assessment of the situation. The current things that are happening always have an origin in what's come before.
We are currently inside the Lord's debating chamber, so when we're looking up on the chamber, we can see, for instance, that there is gilded lettering around the edge of each of these square panels. They were actually carved to be permeable to air because these were vents. These were used to extract the hot air from the House of Lords.
Good afternoon and welcome to the second edition of our Next Generation Impact series, where we'll be covering all aspects of the impact agenda. We had a little teaser there of some of the research impact stories that have been happening at the University of Kent. Now, today's event is titled Embedding Impact in Research from Planning to Publication. The attention to impact within a grant funding application is vital, but how can you actually predict the impact your research may have? A big question, and one our esteemed University of Kent panel of Professor Richard Whitman, Dr. Jennifer Lee and Dr. Jennifer Hiscock will unpick, as well as exploring different approaches to embedding impact storytelling into grant applications. If you're watching us on YouTube or Facebook, you can join in the discussion by sending us any questions or comments in the live chat sidebars on whichever stream you're watching on. We'll then put those to Professor Whitman, Dr. Lee and Dr. Hiscock. You can also tweet your questions and comments using the hashtag NextGenerationImpact. So let's get stuck in, and I want to start off by going around the group and finding out a little bit more about your respective areas of research. Dr. Hiscock, let's come to you first to kick things off. Share with us a little bit about your research journey.
Thank you very much. So I started with a BSc in biomedicinal chemistry from the University of Exeter, and then moved on to get a PhD in supramolecular chemistry from the University of Southampton. I then spent 5 years in defence-centred research between the University of Southampton and Porton Down in Salisbury, spearheading a whole load of impact projects there. I was then awarded the Caldine Research Fellowship at the University of Kent and initiated my independent research career here with an idea to research materials, but that didn't quite happen. I then got appointed lecturer 2016, reader in supramolecular chemistry 2019, and was awarded a UKRI Future Leader Fellowship in September 2020. My research before moving to Kent was centred around the development of chemical weapons defence technologies, but now I am involved in the development of a patented novel class of antimicrobial agents. I also invented a new class of anti-cancer agents and a new class of drug delivery and drug enhancement agents, but still keep my fingers and toes in the defence sector just because it interests me, really. More to that, I also support the community by an international Women in Supramolecular Chemistry network that I initiated with 3 of my friends in November 2019. And this network now supports over 900 members internationally through a number of mentorship programs and peer group projects, and recently, in collaboration with work with Jennifer Lee, we've published some of our initial research findings in a journal called Angevanta. So yeah, that's a little bit about my research and where I came from.
It's quite a journey, Dr. Hiscock. What's been the impact generated from some of your research?
The impact generated from some of my research would be my list of patents associated with my antimicrobial technology. The development of novel drugs takes a while to get to market, but we're certainly looking at moving in that direction. But I suppose my greatest impact to date would have to be centred around the support of other women in STEM through this initiation of this Women into Supramolecular Chemistry network, and also some of the research done in the defence sector.
Such an important area as well, women in STEM. Dr. Lee, let's come to you. Would you like to give us a brief overview of your research?
Of my research, so I work in the Centre for Study of Higher Education, and I use a variety of different methods that are based around embodiment, creative, reflective approaches. I have a degree in chemistry. I thought you were going to ask me about my research journey, so I'm slightly off-centre. I have a degree in chemistry, and I started collaborating with Jen Hiscock when she was a very difficult student of mine on a PGCHE. And we've kind of been thinking for the last couple of years how we can bring some of my work into the work that she does. And so what we do is that we collaborate on this work around WISC, Women in Supramolecular Chemistry, looking to see how we can support the retention and progression of women. But I also use my approaches in other spheres as well, so looking around ableism in academia and accessibility in academia, and also supporting postdoctoral researchers who are another marginalised group in academia. And there I lead on a project which gives postdoctoral researchers the opportunity to develop a research application and then work with an undergraduate. We target widening participation of undergraduates and giving them real experience of cutting edge research. And this all helps to develop a really positive research environment at the university.
Absolutely, and you prompted me there as well to just tell us a little bit about your journey as well. We also heard a really fascinating one from Dr. Hiscock. Tell us a little bit about your journey.
So mine was a little less straightforward. I did a degree in chemistry within analytical science at the University of Birmingham. I fell pregnant whilst I was a student, had a year out to have a baby, whereas other people went into business or went to France. I then started postgraduate research, did 2.5 years of a PhD in computational chemistry, and encountered a lot of those barriers against the progression of women personally. Ended up getting expelled because I was pregnant with my second child, trained as a yoga teacher, a somatic movement therapist, then did a PhD in education, a couple of postdocs in psychology before moving into higher education. And now I'm a full member of the Royal Society of Chemistry, which it kind of feels a bit like I'm going full circle with it all.
It's an amazing story, and I think already early on it's really clear to viewers that there's no one set route when it comes to research and that research journey. Professor Whitman, let's bring you in now, hear about your story, your research journey, which I understand is obviously quite different to Dr. Lee and Dr. Hiscock.
Well, thanks, Cameron. Yes, my academic work has focused on EU politics and policy making in the areas of foreign security and defence policy. And it's gone through different phases, as most researchers' work does. I've sort of engaged with broader EU policy making, and more recently, I'll come back to this in a moment, focused on the UK's relationship with the EU and Europe. And now thinking a bit more about how that relates to the broader question of Britain's place in the world. So, to explain why I've kind of ranged across those interests, I kicked off my academic career in a post-92 University of Westminster in London. I had a post there that was very heavily focused on teaching. Then a few years in, I took a period of unpaid leave to go and take on the position of head of the Europe programme at the Royal Institute of International Affairs, otherwise known as Chatham House, which is a research institute or think tank. And for me, that was a pretty informative and I think possibly sort of life-changing experience, in the sense that it was a different environment from universities, in which there were sort of daily interactions with policymakers and journalists and so on. I learned a very different approach to writing, contracted writing, but also writing for non-academic audiences, as well as doing media commentary. I learned about fundraising, which I was certainly not very good at. But also crucially, I think, and this is one thing that was relevant in the part of the think tank world that I was working in, there is this kind of pulse of immediacy and relevance, which was important. From Chatham House, I went back to academia, to Bath, and I've done a lot of the traditional service roles like head of department, as well as the usual teaching and research roles. But I've tried to remain engaged as much as possible with policymakers, think tankers, and journalists through writing, speaking, evidence giving, and so on. And sort of reflecting on this, it's not a twin track career, but I think of it more that I have a day job, which is my academic position, but alongside that, I'm a sort of enthusiastic hobbyist, seeking out opportunities to engage outside the academy.
Absolutely. 3 really fascinating journeys there to start the programme. And as I said at the top of the programme, if you've got any questions that you want to send in, those viewers at home, you can send those in via the YouTube and Facebook live chat panels. We'll put those to our panel shortly. Richard, coming back to you, obviously the title of today's event is Embedding Impact in Research. For you were talking about some of those stakeholders and individuals that you dealt with. What is the importance of involving a number of diverse stakeholders as part of one's research and as having them as part of an impact network?
No, I think it's a great question. I mean, I think to start where you finish the network question, I mean, this is something that takes time to build, and it's normally built, I think, on the basis of both your sort of demonstrated knowledge and competence, and having the ability to conduct a conversation with people who are interested in your work. And I think that in and of itself gives you a bit of a buzz, or certainly gives me a bit of a buzz, in terms of wanting to remain engaged. I think sometimes it's hard work because, particularly outside the university sector, people work on different timescales and so on, and often have deadlines which are different from ours, journalists in particular. But I mean, for me, it's been a sort of enriching process in the sense that I've learnt a lot about some of the things I thought I understood in terms of the way that policy gets made, and realisation that perhaps not all of our models capture that. But in turn, I've had some opportunities to engage with policy makers, writing for them, and being involved in some of the ways in which they've started to shape up their thinking in areas of policy. And for me, that's been a fascinating experience.
I want to come back to that engagement a little bit later on, but just to answer a question that we've had in from Ian Boucher. He said, what are the panel's thoughts as to how much the removal of explicit pathways to impact statements from UK RI proposals has harmed the ability to ensure impact is always well embedded? I'll come to you, Dr. Hiscock, with that one.
Okay, so yeah, that was a bit of a controversial move. There's some people that think it's a brilliant idea, those that are more on the fundamental side of things, and those that are more on the implied side of things think quite like that impact statement. I think that university and my area of science specifically, it needs impact. It's the reason that I get up in the morning is for my research to have impact. Otherwise, I'm not a very fundamental based scientist. So that tends to get written into my proposals anyway. It's a core output, it's a core deliverable. And I think that that's sometimes when writing those impact studies within the UKRI, you end up writing the same thing twice almost. So I think that in some ways, the removal streamlines the entire application process and perhaps makes these proposals a little bit more like a business-based proposal, than they would traditionally be seen as a research proposal, if that kind of makes any sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And Dr. Hiscock there obviously saying quite a controversial move. Dr. Lee, what are your thoughts on that recent decision?
I think there's a difference between having work that has real life impact. So, a lot of the work I do is around making the world a better place, making academia a kinder place, if you want to think of it that way, supporting marginalised communities. And that's not necessarily the same as research impact in a way that's measured. So as long as researchers keep that focus on making the world better, making it different, having impact and not just doing work inside a box, then I think it can be a really positive change. If they lose the focus on impact at all, then it's slightly more controversial.
Yes, Ian, thank you very much for sending in that question. We've also had a question in from Catherine, who's a REF Impact Officer at the University of Sussex. She's asked, how can we better support the full research cycle regarding impact? Dr. Lee, let's stick with you on that one.
I think it really helps to have people who are talking to you about it and working with you. I think I was involved in developing an impact case study, and as it turned out, my work on ableism wasn't included in the end, partly because it was very new, but it's given me more of an insight into the kinds of things that can be taken as impact in the research sense, which again is very different to actually wanting to make a difference with your work. So I think having those conversations, making sure that the impact officers are talking to researchers, finding out what they do, and getting to know their work so that they can start thinking about how this all can add together and how it can make a difference.
I'm interested as well, Professor Whitman, to hear your thoughts on that question there from Catherine about supporting the full research cycle regarding impact. As you kind of alluded to in your introduction, you've had a lot of exposure with your work. You've appeared in front of parliamentary committees, a member of a number of think tanks. How crucial is having that exposure, I guess a lot of media exposure as well, in supporting a research project and as an impact as part of the cycle?
Well, I think, for me, I think the research and the engagement kind of goes together in the sense that, I've learned a lot from talking to people outside the academy, and perhaps some of their concerns wouldn't automatically fit with my concerns, or even Funding Council's concerns, although we've got better on that across time. I mean, I think that there's a lot of work has gone into demystifying what impact is, and I think that's been a very, very good thing. But I think there's still a lot more work to be done, both to get people to think about how impact is something which it's possible to have in multiple ways rather than a fairly narrow sense. And I think it's still possible to hear colleagues who would think that impact's not for them, and I think it's for all of us, frankly, because as long as we're taking public money and we're sort of embedded within our communities and in our societies, we do have an impact. I think what's more difficult is to look at the ways in which institutions can kind of pick that up and provide opportunity, particularly for early career researchers, where this is now something which is built into promotion and other processes. So it's something that it's difficult for people to dodge if they want to advance in a higher education career. But at the same time, they may sort of struggle to understand how they can start to build impact and start to build a case for impact for themselves.
We've had a lot of questions coming in about development of research and also predicting impact. We're going to come on to those shortly, but one of the countless people to have benefited from your work, Professor Whitman, is Sophie Behr, Senior Research Fellow at the Centre for European Reform. She sent in her thoughts on the impact of your research specifically.
Hi, my name is Sophia. I work at the Center for European Reform's Berlin office, and as a think tanker, I've worked particularly on the subject of European defence and the role of the EU in defence throughout the Brexit referendum campaign, and then on the future of the UK-EU defence relationship. And Richard Whitman's work on the subject has always really stood out to me. I have learned a lot from him over the course of the last 5 or so years. I think he's one of a few voices who provides measured, constructive analysis on the subject, always with really profound insights into both the UK's position and into the deliberations of Brussels and the member states as well. And I think we will all continue to rely on his work because both sides continue to try to figure out the future shape of their foreign and defence policy relationship. I think after the referendum, both the UK and the EU were quite confident that on these issues, the new relationship that would be beneficial for both sides could be struck quite easily. But then a lot of goodwill was lost early on over defense industrial issues. And over the course of the negotiations, foreign policy really was pushed more and more into the background. And so I think going forward, it might seem straightforward to rely on entirely informal contacts between Brussels and London and on bilateral relationships between the UK and individual EU member states. But as the EU is also attempting to deepen its own foreign policy and defense footprint, I think that both sides would benefit from remaining flexible and open to closer and more structured forms of cooperation in the future. And so I look forward to reading more work from Richard on this subject.
Sophie Behr there. We've had a question in from Andy Stiles. How can you predict the impact from the offset? Dr. Lee, would you like to take that one?
Oh, that's a really hard question. I think you can't predict the impact. I mean, if you're working on something that you know affects a lot of people, like ableism or like marginalisation, then you can assume that it's going to have some kind of impact. I think, kind of coming back to the previous question and some of Richard's comments about how the importance of having impact throughout, and how if you're taking public money, then you have to be representative. I think it's really important that as researchers are representative, so that we are diverse in terms of skin colour, ethnicity, race, religion, sexuality, that we also make sure that the research impact officers and the research teams behind us can ensure that there's accessibility built in as well, so that we can support researchers and the public to engage with our work, whether they have a disability or chronic illness or any other kind of protected characteristic.
Is being able to incorporate all of that, is what you just said, and being able to maybe predict that in advance, how that is going to that specific impact, is that maybe a secret to the success of a research project, Dr. Lee?
I think it can be. You know, you have to live what you believe. You know, there's no point, for example, me saying that I want to research into ableism and look at accessibility if I don't try and make sure that my work is accessible to everybody who wants to engage with it. And I think maybe it's easier to predict engagement with work than it is research impact, if that makes sense, because you can try and engage people in a whole lot of different forums. So you have to produce the research outputs, the papers that you write, but then you also have to engage with people and talk to people about it. And that might mean writing in a different way or speaking to different audiences. And then through that engagement, that is how you eventually will produce that pathway to impact.
On the subject of successful pathways to impact, Jenny Reynolds from the University of Bath has sent in a question: how to best develop successful pathways to impact? Dr. Hiscock, I'll come to you for that one.
So I think it's about splitting it down into your short-term aims, your medium-term aims, and your long-term aims, and to build it from there. And those really high impacts would perhaps come at the long-term aim. So you're looking at perhaps 5 to 7 years, because any form of research you do is going to take a while to reach as many people as possible within your communities. So when I'm looking at this, it's always considering my short term, so the immediate impacts in the first 6 months to maybe 2 years, and then that 2 year to 5 year space, and then that 5 year to 7 year space.
So having that kind of schedule, I guess, arranged in advance, working on that. Jenny, thank you very much for sending in that question. Hopefully that's helped you out there. John Shepherd from Royal Holloway has sent in a question as well. Do the panel have suggestions for planning and developing activities that will amplify the reach of their impact? Dr. Hiscock, we're going to stick with you.
Okay, so when you're considering this, people often talk about maybe hosting a small workshop, maybe doing some events within their university centre, such as getting school kids in and maybe doing a bit of a tea time lecture series with cupcakes and stuff like that. I think it's about thinking outside of the box and doing something that you've never seen or heard of before, with all these social media channels and stuff like that coming to the forum. Doing things like YouTube channels and stuff like that has become an awful lot more exciting and accessible for a wide number of people. So I would be thinking when you're planning these things to really go outside the box, especially if you're putting this on research applications and stuff like that, because every time you review one, it's another workshop or another school activity. You really want to push the boat out on novelty there.
And Professor Whitman, for you as well, looking at arranging some of those, planning and developing some of those activities, what words of advice would you have?
Well, I think, social media and also alongside that, the open access agenda, I think that makes a huge difference in terms of the ability to push out what you're working on and to have an ongoing conversation with people who might otherwise not have been able to engage with your work. I mean, I had a fantastic opportunity in 2016 in that I was a senior, one of the ESRC funded senior fellows on the UK in a Changing Europe program, which was set up to improve public engagement, public understanding in the run-up to the Brexit referendum and its aftermath. And for me, a great part of that initiative was that we did a lot of work, for example, with local media. We did a lot of work traveling around the UK, public meetings and so on. We did a kind of gardener's question time, public events where people came in to ask their questions or have their question answered about how the EU operated. And it was a very good example of something which obviously wasn't political campaigning, but was intended to put together expertise with the intention of increasing public understanding. And it also, of course, it was a very salutary experience in terms of limits of conveying understanding. But I think those kinds of initiatives, would do better to be more expansively funded.
And Dr. Lee, something that we picked up from Professor Whitman and Dr. Hiscock is having that real diverse range of activities, and I guess really important as well to answer John's question is casting that net wide as well, and making sure that you tap into those people who are really going to benefit from that impact, whether that's nationally or internationally, even in some cases.
Absolutely. I mean, it's been really interesting doing the work with WISC because obviously we're aiming at women and people from marginalised genders who are post-PhD. We've actually been funded for a public engagement project, and the definition of public engagement for the Royal Society is people without a science degree, and yet they want you to have a public engagement around your research project. So it was really interesting for us to kind of think about how we can try and use the work that we were doing and the research that we were doing to engage with people without a science degree. And what we came up with was a public engagement channel, which we haven't launched yet. We're planning to launch in the summer, in collaboration with some work we're doing with a new charity out in Ghana across Africa. That charity is looking to increase the visibility or the number of Black women in STEM, and our work is about trying to increase the visibility of women within chemistry, within supramolecular chemistry. And they two mesh together really nicely because we can join with them to increase the visibility of Black women in STEM and hopefully persuade young women that this is a career that they can do, to make it achievable and one that is realistic. And the way that we're doing this is we are getting behind the scenes footage in labs. So I'm in the lab, I'll be there this afternoon, and I'm filming and I'm recording and I'm chatting and I'm spending a lot of time with Jen Hiscock's research group. And some of that footage we're then using to create short videos that will be out on YouTube and potentially TikTok and other social media channels, with the express aim of engaging and attracting young women, young people who might not have necessarily thought that science was a career that they could do, or might not know what it actually entails. So, for example, you're on your feet a lot. So there's going to be one video definitely about shoes and what you wear and how you can be comfortable in the lab.
Well, I'm glad the camera's not panned down on my choice shoes for today. We've also keys us up really nicely. You talking about videos there. We've got one lined up from one that you produced in the lab. Do you want to maybe give us a little bit of background?
So this was one of the first bits of footage that I took when I was in the lab, and I went in there with the intention of using a camera, recording, talking, doing a very ethnographic approach, kind of getting behind the scenes and talking to people and making notes. And almost the moment that I walked into the lab, I realised it was really loud, which is going to cause incredible logistical issues when it comes to shooting quality that is good enough for filming. So rather than doing anything about the sound in the lab, because I can't make them turn off all the machines, I decided to edit a short video looking at precisely how noisy it is.
Well, let's take a look at that now.
Have you ever wondered just how noisy a lab is?
may not be fine. I'm going to run around.
A little auditory snapshot there of being in the lab. We've had a couple more questions come in from Louise Jones and also seconded by Helen Green. They've asked, what are the best incentives higher education institutes can offer for this work? Time, financial support, reward, career progression, or no incentives required? Dr. Hiscock, I'll let you take that one.
I think it depends on what drives the individual, and as you have multiple individuals that you're trying to get impact out from, you probably need a span of all of those things. I think what I would suggest would really help is when opportunities come up for an individual to produce impact, to make that process as streamlined as possible. And this can be to have small pots of money available within the university that you can apply for impact, somewhere like even £1,500 to £2,000. If you have an opportunity come up, can really help you initiate that impact. And just making people aware of how that impact can help their career progression. And that would be very helpful for universities to better flag at the early career researcher level, because you're so focused on just trying to make your research work. Perhaps you can get sidetracked from the impact at that point.
And Dr. Lee, you were talking about those really inspiring, or that really inspiring project you got in Ghana among the many others that you've worked on. Louise and Helen's question there about incentives. Is that something that does help, or is it if you're so passionate and committed to a project, the incentives are just a nice cherry on top?
I think as you were listing the incentives, I was thinking, yeah, all of them. I think having funding, having support, having it tied into promotion and progression, I think all of that is really important, because when it comes down to it, as an individual, we're working in an environment which is incredibly competitive. So we have to put our effort into things that will benefit the world, but also benefit ourselves and our careers. There's no point doing loads of impact work if it's just going to get you sidelined. It'll end up being like EDI work, something that's incredibly worthwhile, but won't necessarily get you to professor. It won't necessarily get you the recognition that you would like to have. So I think we need to have all of those incentives, just as Jenna said, and a whole range of them, so that you can cater to encourage people and support people to get involved in impact throughout their career.
I guess as well, there's a timeliness as well to research. Professor Whitman, you've obviously done a lot of work on Brexit. We're now in that next stage of the Brexit journey. What for you and for that side with the research, is it something that is going to be maybe a challenge for you in that we've passed that Brexit deadline? We're in that new phase. Brexit is a bit of history now. Is there going to be that challenge to still have that research out there and show that relevance to that research?
Well, certainly in the areas that I work, and for my colleagues, who've looked at the EU and the UK's relationship with the EU, I mean, they've undergone something of a journey, over the last few years. On the one hand, they've had a sort of perhaps a level of interest in their research, which wasn't the case before 2016. But there are also all sorts of questions begged about, what does it mean to be a researcher working on those kind of topics in the UK, and also because a lot of the work that people have been doing has been sort of the moment and doesn't necessarily automatically translate into academic publication output, for example, particularly if you're writing things which are much more speculative, shall we say, about where the impacts of decisions, public policy decisions, might end up. So I think that it's not always easy to plan for that, but to connect with the comments made back to the previous question, I think one of the things we have to look at is the ability to move in and out of higher education and to be very nimble in terms of taking up opportunity. I mean, I think I've been lucky in the sense that I've always been well supported by my university. But I think at the same time, there are some things which you can only take, opportunities you can only take up if you can do them now, and that doesn't always fit with people who are locked into teaching commitments and so on. And the longer you stay away from higher education, perhaps if you go on as a secondment and something, the more difficult it is to get back in, if you like, particularly in terms of things like publication, which may be important for promotion.
Well, one of the comments we've got in pretty much hits the nail on the head with that point, saying responsive funding for impact is needed, but it's very tough to manage and account for fairly. So it's always going to be a big challenge there. Dr. Lee, let's come on to you, talking about how vital showing impact is in a funding application. You talked about some of the projects you've done with WISC and the work that's happening in Ghana. How helpful is it having that, showing that impact in a funding application, even if it's kind of predicting that possible impact that could come up?
I think one of the things that I'm good at, and Jen and I are good at together, is identifying outputs. So it's not necessarily identifying impact, but it's saying what we want to come out of things at every stage. So whether we're working on collaborative autoethnography, we've got surveys running open for WISC at the moment, and we're always thinking, okay, so what output do we want? Where do we want to put it? Who do we want to reach with this? And I think that's a lot easier to plan for than impact, which is around affecting policy and affecting change, and it's more than just reaching people. So yeah, I don't know if Jen, if you'd want to come in on that one as well, because I know this is something that we've definitely developed together in the work that we do.
This is something that the outputs of which could never have been achieved without the collaboration of Jen and I together, and a number of other people such as Anna McConnell at the University of Kiel in Germany, Claudia Caltagirone at the University of Calgary in Italy, and also Callie Haynes at UCL. And it's bringing those people together, bringing that mindset together, and keeping an eye on what we want to achieve as a group of individuals. The impact will come if the work is good enough. The impact will come if it's of interest to a number of people. The impact will come if you're passionate about communicating it. And sometimes trying to create impact is in my view, becomes wasted effort. If things are going to pick up, somebody will grab hold of it, someone will see it, someone will comment on it, especially using social media platforms, and it'll start to run away. You only have to look at the first research article that WISC put out as a group of individuals. It was produced on International Women's Day, and it's had tremendous success, more than we could have ever hoped to have achieved as individuals. And that wasn't something we went out with to say, let's change the world. It just is making changes based on our passion.
You mentioned it there about seeing it through with your passions and getting that across to people. But how do you go about engaging with people on topics that can be quite sensitive? You know, there's you mentioned there that there can be issues with gender politics. Professor Whitman's obviously looking at Brexit, a hugely divisive issue. Dr. Hiscock, how have you found navigating that with your research?
So we've actually had tremendous success in this area. Chemistry is, up to very recent times, more of a male type area, especially in MPIs. But in including those individuals within our discussions, in having this community-led approach, in choosing to educate rather than blame, in choosing not to enforce our ideas on other people, but giving them the space to look at what we produce and make their own decisions based on our outputs, we've actually been very much supported by the entire community globally. So I think you have to be sensitive and you have to be prepared to educate. But as researchers, we should be presenting the evidence we have in an unbiased fashion and be prepared to have those discussions in a non-aggressive format.
And that must be really challenging, or had been really challenging for you, Professor Whitman, with Brexit, such a bipartisan topic, or partisan topic, sorry, I should say, that must have been something that was a real challenge for you in getting across your research in that unbiased way.
Well, I mean, it was a challenge for the public or the electorate. I mean, in terms of working out what they felt about what was a major decision that they were asked to take. I mean, I think that, one of the ways in which I've realised that I need to sort of adjust what I do and say is that, when you're coming with a university affiliation, that can be a turn-off for a lot of people, because we represent an environment perhaps that they know absolutely nothing about, or it could be that they're just immediately hostile because they think as a sort of socioeconomic group that individuals like me, white male professors, perhaps aren't able to connect with them in a way that seems relevant. And we've also operated, I think, in a certainly around the Brexit issue, in a hostile environment in which some politicians have suggested that our evidence, if you like, our expertise may not be legitimate or may be irrelevant or may be skewed. And I think what we have to recognise that all of that is part of the landscape for us now as researchers. If we want to be out having these conversations beyond the academy. And I'm not really sure how well institutions do a job of sort of equipping individuals for that. People who are active on social media, for example, are pretty much left to themselves to manage what may blow up as a major piece of to and fro when they get some of their research out there, particularly if it's perceived as being controversial. That's not just an issue in politics, of course, but it's, for example, on vaccination. People who work on vaccines and vaccine implementation of vaccine policy.
Yeah, we've had a comment in from Saskia. I just want to say, she said, Dr. Hiscock's comments on importance of self-motivation, very important, but also the fact that it's very hard to generalise about creating impact as individuals and pathways are so diverse. Saskia, thank you for sending that in. And I think that brings us, we're coming to the end of our event, so that brings me around to kind of the final round of questions that I want to go around the group with. Professor Whitman, let's start with you. Words of advice to colleagues around embedding impact in their research?
Well, I mean, my word of advice is, I think everybody has a different journey on impact. The things that I've learned, what I did learn were before impact became sort of all-consuming for institutions. So I'm still grappling with what we mean by impact, and that includes through the REF process. But I think more than anything else, the importance is to not be closed off as to what you might understand impact being. Because if you just look across our institution, I mean, we have an amazing set of codified examples of impact in our impact case studies that we put forward to the last REF and to this one. And those are a great starting point for making you realise that the claims for impact that people have and the way that they're evidenced and the way in which they're able to demonstrate reach and significance are absolutely incredible. So approach it with an open mind, I think, but don't think that somebody else's example is going to be a good guide for you.
Yeah, Janice Murray, REF coordinator at the University of Edinburgh, echoing some of that there. We must remember the importance of measuring impact. An example, what change happens afterwards, which is hard to do for social media content sometimes. Janice, thank you very much for sending those comments in. Dr. Hiscock, coming to you with the final comment from you on your words of advice to colleagues around embedding impact in their research.
I think you have to do what feels natural for your project. I don't think you can force it in there. If the opportunities arrive, grab them with both hands. And remember why we got into research, which was to have fun. Every time that I try and do something where I don't have fun, I'm not enthusiastic about it, I generally don't produce any impact or probably any form of research that matters to anyone either. So find your own enjoyment in the projects that you're doing, and the impact will come. And recognize when it does, and log things and screenshot all social media.
Absolutely. Dr. Lee, over to you for a final word.
I completely agree with what Richard and Jen have said. Do the research that matters to you. If you can, make the world a kinder place by doing it and doing that work, then the impact will follow from that. None of the work that I do, I set out to have impact. I just wanted to do work that mattered to me, that I was passionate about, and that I think would make the world a better place.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lee, Dr. Hiscock and Professor Whitman for providing much food for thought today. And of course, thank you to all of you at home for tuning in and sending through all your fantastic questions and comments for our latest edition of the Next Generation Impact series. We'll be back at the same time on Thursday, the 27th of May for Maximising Impact, Working in Partnership. So do put that date in the diary. All details are on the University of Kent Research Excellence Team's webpage. But for now, enjoy the rest of your day, and we'll see you again for another exciting conversation very soon. Goodbye.
Zacatecas, like the rest of western Mexico, was deeply affected by the Cristero War. To this day, the war continues to affect the lives of ordinary people and even their relations with church and state. Many people see this as a religious war, and indeed it was a religious war, but it was much more than that.
I believe that in the case of Peru, but everywhere as well, it is very important to know what has happened in the past so that you have a real assessment of the situation. The current things that are happening always have an origin in what's come before.
We are currently inside the Lord's debating chamber, so when we're looking up on the chamber, we can see, for instance, that there is gilded lettering around the edge of each of these square panels. They were actually carved to be permeable to air because these were vents. These were used to extract the hot air from the House of Lords.